Hi, and welcome to Test Prep Dojo's series on the GMAT. This is our 99th percentile verbal series. So I'm going to be doing a video every day that discusses one of the primary topics for the verbal section. Mostly at the moment I've been focused on sentence correction, but I'll also do critical reasoning and reading comp questions. One of the challenging things about the verbal section is that if you look at a lot of the prep material that's out there, there's a tendency to try to understand rules for everything, to sort of outwork the exam in the sense that you will have memorized all the rules for all the different grammatical constructions you will see. And I'm here to tell you that that's one thing that is 100% impossible. There's an infinite number of rules and combinations of grammatical constructions that you'll see, and that's really not the way to do it. The way to do it is to understand what the main testable issues are. It's really not that extensive a list, and to be very systematic about scanning the answer choices, identifying the decision points, and then just using those main concepts to knock out the wrong answer choices. So I got a 99th percentile score doing this, and you certainly can too. So what we're going to be talking about today is some issues with modifiers, which is incredibly important for the exam to know what they do, what they modify, and ultimately, as always, the most important thing, to understand how they further the author's intended meaning. Ultimately, if you can do that, you know the important rules, and you're able to balance that with an understanding of the meaning. That's how you unlock the super high 700 plus scores on the exam, at least for the verbal side. So I'm not going to read these out loud. You can pause the video and do that, but we have a sentence about Warren Buffett's letters to his shareholders. In the non-underlined portion, we have a that modifier. And as we know, what that modifier does is it takes a larger population of something, in this case letters to his shareholders, and it restricts them to a particular subset of that larger population. So in this case, it's a letters to shareholders that were published in this book. And so this sentence, as always, has multiple issues that are being tested, but one of the primary ones is a modifier issue, which is what makes it a good one for this video. So if you look at, so I'm going to skip A, because that's actually a pretty, that one is closer to right than some of the other ones. And so first we're just going to look at B, C, and E. So we have Warren Buffett's letters to his shareholders that were published in his book. In B, we have the subject, which is the letters to his shareholders that were published in the book. And then we have the verb were written, and then we have over a period that begins, so on and so forth. So this one is actually wrong because one of the primary decision points, which is this issue with outnumbering or outnumber. And so we can't have a modifier like this. You can't say the letters to shareholders were written and then just outnumber. This is not a correct construction for a modifier. It's wildly incorrect from a grammar perspective. And so we know this one's wrong. And then C, we have letters to shareholders that were published in his book. And then we have this is perfectly okay to say written over a period of time, but the problem with C is that written over a period and then outnumbering are put in parallel, and so this acts as one long modifier, and thus, if you read this entire thing, it has no primary verb. It's a fragment, and so this one also is wildly wrong from a grammatical perspective. The which modifier is okay here in D, so which modifies a noun, so it's the noun of the it's the letters that were published, and those are what was written, so that's okay. And so, but this one suffers from this same issue, which is this which modifier just doesn't end. The which were written and outnumber are put in parallel, thus this sentence doesn't have a main verb. It's also a fragment. So those are all those should be pretty easy to eliminate. So We have now the slightly more challenging issue, which is A versus E. And so the issue here is really being able to understand what the ing form of the modifier or of a verb modifies. And so um, we have to understand the meaning and what is meant to outnumber something. And so what's doing the outnumbering is the letters, but an ing form of a modifier here does not modify the preceding noun like a which modifier does. It modifies the action of the prior clause. And so that it actually modifies this were written here, which, if you, from a meaning perspective, it really doesn't make sense. However, in E, we have Warren Buffett's letters, which were written. The which, as I mentioned, modifies the prior noun, so which is the letters to his shareholders, that's correct. And then the letters outnumber, and so that works. So in this context, that's correct. The issue is that this outnumber is the main verb, whereas here, this were written is the main verb for this version, and so that's why B doesn't work, but it works perfectly well for E. So that's why that's our answer choice, and it largely is dependent on this issue with the outnumbering and the ing form of the modifier. So definitely know what that is when you're doing sentence correction questions. So sentence 2 for today. According to researchers who monitored its trajectory, an expanding group of meteorites diverted by the moon's gravitational pull. So we have a sentence about a group of meteorites, and there's a couple things going on here. Certainly, modifier issues being one of them, and so the um, the issue with A here is the which modifier. So this modifier is actually okay. So it modifies the expanding group of meteorites, and so that works. But it's very important that we know what it is doing in terms of the meaning. So that's okay. It's also important to understand that an expanding group of meteorites, all this diverted by the moon's gravitational pull. Um, so so recently catalyzed a significant disturbance in the magnetic field that encircles Earth. Um, so what does this which modifier actually modify? It's the significant disturbance. So it is important to note that you can have a prepositional phrase in between in the magnetic field that encircles Earth. If it's not the magnetic field that encircles Earth that illuminated the night sky, but it doesn't have to exactly be right next to the comma for this to work. So just know that, don't get thrown off by that. You can have a prepositional phrase in between the noun that the which modifier is actually modifying. The issue here is actually parallelism. So illuminated and also possibly destroying. Those tenses are so. Remember, in parallel constructions, do they have to be in the same tense? No, but if they're referring to the same time and there's a the logical meaning implies that they should be in the same tense, then they should be. Here they're not, so that's why A is actually wrong. Um, so an expanding group of meteorites is okay in B, but again, it comes down to there's a pronoun issue, so it's not really clear what it refers to. That's a bit ambiguous. Illuminated the night sky and also possibly destroyed. Um, so, and it illuminated the night sky and also possibly destroyed. So, those are in parallel. That's okay, but we have the it issue here, and that's why I believe B is wrong. Um, the reason this is a good, so we're going to skip C. There's actually another good little trick here for D and E, but this sort of changes it from sort of this active construction to this more passive sort of reverse construction. Um, for D&E, it begins with a significant disturbance in the magnetic field that encircles Earth. Um, these are actually wrong, we know, just from meaning, because in the ununderlined bit we have this its and trajectory. They're not monitoring the trajectory of the significant disturbance. So, right, based on that, we can eliminate D&E, but there are other issues as well. Um, there's this it again, it's an ambiguous pronoun, and then these two are not in parallel. So there's multiple issues going on here. So we can eliminate those two based on multiple issues. But the reason I wanted to come back to C is there's a really important item to point out, and which is, there's not, as much as you'd like to think, there's not always a really strong reason why all of the wrong answers are wrong. There is something to be said for the right answer is the one that best conveys the author's intended meaning. And so, my point is, it's nice to think you can sort of mathematically have like a very strong grammatical reason to eliminate the wrong answer choices. That's not always the case, but sometimes you can see why the right answer really elegantly conveys the meaning the best. So illuminating and destroying are in parallel here. And the ing modifier modifies the action of the prior clause. So these both describe this recently catalyzed, this significant disturbance. That makes perfect sense. That's 100% correct. And also, the ing modifiers conveys this notion of sort of contemporaneous action. So the illuminating and the destroying are occurring simultaneously with this catalyzation, and that also makes perfect sense. And so that's why the ing modifiers are the best to convey this meaning. So again, it's really important to understand exactly what they do, because even some of the other ones that have elements that are correct. So, for example, you could look at A, B, and C and say, well, they all have this an expanding bit right. That is what the researchers are monitoring the trajectory of. So even if you said, okay, those could all be potential candidates, um, this one is the only one that really conveys this notion of this simultaneous or contemporaneous action that the description that the modifiers are meant to convey. So good sentences. Again, know the system. Understand the nothing that you memorize in terms of rules can replace the understanding of the author's meaning. Know what the meaning is. Know based on the meaning what should be in parallel. Understand ing modifiers. They modify the action of the prior clause, and they convey this notion of contemporaneous action occurring, contemporaneous ness or simultaneousness with the action of the prior clause. And then know the which modifiers, that modifiers, which modifiers modify the preceding noun, that modifiers restrict the larger population to a subset. But understanding modifiers of all types is extraordinarily important to getting a great score. Please visit the site, testprep.